The rusted gates of Blackwater Correctional Facility screamed against the October wind as Maya Chen stepped onto the cracked asphalt, her 6-month belly pressing against her coat. The inheritance papers felt heavy in her trembling hands, heavier than the life growing inside her, heavier than the debt collector's threats that drove her here. Maya wasn't just any desperate heir seeking quick cash from selling the property. She was Dr. Maya Chen, forensic psychiatrist, who'd spent years studying the minds of killers. She'd interviewed hundreds of inmates, but she'd never told anyone about the nightmares that plagued her childhood, nightmares of concrete walls and screaming voices that her grandmother had dismissed as an overactive imagination. Now, standing before the prison her grandmother had secretly owned for 30 years, those childhood terrors felt less like dreams and more like memories. The facility was supposed to be empty, condemned since 1987. So why were there fresh footprints in the dust leading to cell block D? And why did the number 237 carved into the doorframe make her unborn child kick violently against her ribs? What was her grandmother hiding in the cell that didn't appear on any prison blueprint? The wind carried the metallic scent of rust and something else, something organic that made Maya's stomach lurch. She pressed one hand to her belly, feeling the baby's restless movements while clutching the heavy brass keys the lawyer had given her. 3 keys for a condemned building seemed excessive, but Grandmother Liu had always been excessive in her secrecy. Maya had driven 12 hours from Chicago with nothing but a duffel bag, her medical texts, and the crushing weight of $60,000 in student loans she couldn't pay. The bank had given her 2 weeks before foreclosure proceedings began on her apartment. Her ex-husband's final words still echoed, "You think you can handle everything alone? Good luck with that." The main door groaned open with surprising ease, as if it had been recently oiled. Maya stepped into the reception area, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Dust motes danced in the grey afternoon light filtering through grimy windows, but the floor showed clear pathways where feet had disturbed the accumulated grime. Someone had been here, recently. Her phone showed no signal, typical for rural Minnesota. Maya followed the footprints deeper into the facility, past the administrative offices where filing cabinets stood with their drawers hanging open like dead mouths. The silence felt alive, pressing against her eardrums with an almost physical weight. Cell Block A was exactly what she expected. Rows of empty cells with rusted bars and graffiti-covered walls. The footprints continued past Block B, past Block C, toward a section of the prison that seemed newer, different. The concrete here was cleaner, the paint less faded. Block D. The number 237 wasn't just carved into the door frame, it was burned there, as if someone had pressed a red-hot brand into the metal. Maya's baby kicked again, harder this time, and she had to lean against the wall to catch her breath. The movement felt wrong, desperate, as if the child was trying to warn her. Through the reinforced glass window, Block D looked different from the others. The cells were larger, more like small rooms, and each door had multiple locks. Maya tried the first key, then the second. The third key turned with a satisfying click, and the door swung open. The corridor beyond was immaculate. No dust, no cobwebs, no signs of abandonment. Emergency lighting strips hummed overhead, impossible since the power had been cut years ago. Maya walked slowly past cells labeled with numbers instead of names, 231, 233, 235, and finally at the end of the corridor, 237. This cell was different. The door was solid steel with no window, and it required all 3 keys to open. Maya's hands shook as she worked each lock, her baby now moving so violently she could see the disturbance beneath her coat. The door opened into darkness. Maya fumbled for her phone's flashlight and stepped inside. The cell was twice the size of the others, with walls covered in photographs, newspaper clippings, and what looked like medical charts. A light played across the images, and her blood turned to ice water. Every photograph showed the same woman at different ages, a woman who looked exactly like Maya. The newspaper clippings dated back 40 years. Local woman disappears. Search continues for missing mother. Police suspect foul play in Chen case. And there, in the center of it all, was a birth certificate for Maya Chen, but the date was wrong, 40 years too early. Maya's phone light caught something else, a hospital bed in the corner, with leather restraints still attached to the rails. Next to it, a small table covered with medical instruments that gleamed as if they'd been recently cleaned. On the table was a note in her grandmother's handwriting: "She always comes back. They always come back. The baby knows the way home." The emergency light suddenly cut out, plunging Maya into absolute darkness. In the silence that followed, she heard something that made her soul freeze, the sound of multiple locks clicking shut behind her. The drive to Millbrook took 3 hours, through increasingly desolate countryside. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the GPS led her down a narrow dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her mounting unease. When the prison finally came into view, Sarah pulled over and stared through the windshield in shock. The structure loomed against the grey October sky like a monument to despair, 4 stories of weathered brick and rusted iron, surrounded by a 20-foot fence topped with coils of razor wire. Guard towers stood sentinel at each corner, their windows dark and empty. She had expected something smaller, maybe an old jailhouse from the town's early days. This was a full-scale penitentiary that could have housed hundreds of inmates. The main gate stood slightly ajar, the chain that had secured it lying broken on the ground. Sarah drove through slowly, gravel crunching under her tires. The yard was overgrown with weeds that pushed through cracks in the concrete, and a rusted basketball hoop hung at an impossible angle. The keys Mr. Patterson had given her felt cold and heavy in her palm as she approached the main entrance. The first key turned easily, as if the lock had been recently oiled. The massive door swung open with a groan that echoed through the empty corridors beyond. The smell hit her immediately. Musty air thick with decades of accumulated dampness, overlaid with something else she couldn't quite identify, something organic and unpleasant that made her stomach turn. She pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting a wave of nausea. The lobby stretched before her, dominated by a security desk behind thick plexiglass. Motivational posters hung askew on the walls, their edges curled and colors faded. Rehabilitation through dedication read one, showing a sunrise over rolling hills that seemed mockingly cheerful in the gloom. Sarah's footsteps echoed as she explored the ground floor, her phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The electricity had been shut off years ago, leaving the building trapped in perpetual twilight. She found the cafeteria with its long metal tables bolted to the floor, a library with empty shelves, and administrative offices filled with scattered paperwork and overturned filing cabinets. It was in the warden's office that she found the first photograph of her grandmother. The black and white picture sat in a frame on a dust-covered desk. A stern-faced woman in a crisp uniform stood beside a man in a suit, both looking directly at the camera with expressions of grim determination. The nameplate on the desk read, "Warden E. Blackwood." Sarah sank into the creaky office chair, studying her grandmother's face. Even in the photograph, Eleanor Blackwood radiated an intimidating presence. Her hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes held a coldness that made Sarah shiver. Her grandmother had been the warden. That explained the inheritance, but it raised so many more questions. Why had Eleanor never mentioned this place? Why had she cut herself off from the family so completely? Sarah opened the desk drawers, searching for answers. Most contained the usual office detritus, dried-up pens, paper clips, a bottle of antacids. But in the bottom drawer, her fingers found a leather-bound journal. The entries were written in her grandmother's precise handwriting, dating back to 1987, the year Sarah's mother had been born, and apparently the year Eleanor had taken over as warden. Sarah flipped through pages of routine administrative notes, budget concerns, and personnel issues. But as she read further, the tone began to change. "The incidents in Block D are increasing," read one entry from October 1987. "3 guards have requested transfers this month alone." Wilson claims he heard voices coming from the sealed section, but those cells have been empty for 15 years. I've ordered a full inspection of the area. Another entry, dated a week later. Inspection revealed structural damage to the wall between cells D-47 and D-48. More concerning is what we found behind it. I've ordered the area sealed permanently. Some things are better left buried. Sarah's hands trembled as she read. The baby moved restlessly, pressing against her ribs as if trying to escape. She flipped ahead in the journal, looking for more references to Block D. November 15th, 1987, the dreams are getting worse. She comes to me every night now, asking why I left her there. But what choice did I have? Some sins can't be forgiven, only contained. December 3rd, 1987, found another guard in Block D this morning, unconscious outside the sealed section. He has no memory of how he got there. I'm beginning to think the prison should be closed entirely, but the state won't hear of it. Too much money invested. The final entry was dated December 24th, 1987. I'm leaving this place. Whatever evil lives in Block D, it's beyond my power to stop. I only pray it stays buried. God forgive me for what I'm leaving behind. Sarah closed the journal with shaking hands. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending a loose shutter banging against the brick wall. She needed to find Block D. The rusty keys felt ice-cold against Sarah's palm as she stood before the prison's main entrance the next morning. The building looked even more imposing in daylight, a brutalist monument of grey concrete and barred windows that seemed to absorb the weak autumn sun rather than reflect it. Behind her, Marcus shifted nervously, his camera bag slung over one shoulder. "You sure about this?" he asked for the third time since they'd parked. "We could hire someone to do an initial assessment first." Sarah shook her head, though her hand trembled slightly as she inserted the largest key into the heavy steel door. "I need to see what's in there myself. What she left me." The lock turned, with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting. The door swung open with a groan that echoed into the darkness beyond, releasing a rush of stale air that carried scents of rust, mildew, and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that made Sarah's stomach lurch. "Jesus," Marcus muttered, pulling out a flashlight. "When was this place last used?" "The record said it closed in 1987, Sarah replied, fishing her own light from her purse. The beams cut through the gloom, revealing a reception area with a thick glass partition and metal detector. Dust motes danced in the light like tiny ghosts. Their footsteps echoed as they moved deeper into the facility. The main corridor stretched ahead of them, lined with doors marked administration, laundry, kitchen. Some doors stood ajar, revealing glimpses of abandoned furniture and equipment. Others were sealed shut, their small windows dark. "Why would your grandmother keep this place?" Marcus asked, playing his light over a bulletin board still covered with yellowed notices and duty rosters. The maintenance costs alone must have been astronomical. Sarah paused at a directory mounted on the wall, its plastic letters spelling out various wings and departments. Her light caught on something that made her breath hitch: special housing unit, basement level. Below it, someone had scratched additional words into the metal with what looked like a key or coin. "Don't go down there. Look at this," she whispered. Marcus leaned closer, reading the crude message. Probably just some kid being dramatic, or a security guard trying to spook his replacement. But Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's temperature. The baby shifted restlessly in her womb, as if responding to her unease. They continued their exploration, finding the warden's office with its imposing desk and wall of filing cabinets, the guard stations with their banks of monitors, the visiting rooms with their scarred tables and uncomfortable chairs. Everything was frozen in time, as if the staff had simply walked away one day and never returned. It was in the main cell block that Sarah found the photograph. The picture lay on the floor near one of the cells, its edges curled and yellow with age. Sarah knelt carefully to pick it up, her flashlight revealing a group of women in matching uniforms standing in what looked like a workshop. The image was grainy, but one face stood out with startling clarity. "That's impossible," she breathed. Marcus looked over her shoulder. "What is it?" Sarah pointed to a woman in the back row, tall and stern-faced, with dark hair pulled severely back. Even in the faded photograph, the resemblance was unmistakable. "That's my grandmother, but look at the uniform. She's dressed like an inmate, not staff." The realization hit her like a physical blow. Eleanor Blackwood, the woman who had raised Sarah's mother in what everyone assumed was quiet respectability, had been a prisoner here. But that was impossible. Sarah's mother had never mentioned anything about her mother being incarcerated. The family story was that Eleanor had been widowed young and worked as a seamstress to support her daughter. "Maybe it's not her," Marcus suggested weakly, but even he didn't sound convinced. Sarah flipped the photo over. In spidery handwriting, someone had written, "Eleanor Blackwood, 1965. Cell Block D. She knows what she did." A sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, a metallic clang like a door slamming shut. Both Sarah and Marcus froze, their lights swinging toward the source of the noise. "Just the building settling," Marcus said, but his voice was tight. Another sound followed, softer but more disturbing, the whisper of footsteps on concrete, coming from the direction of the stairwell that led to the basement levels. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her belly as the baby kicked hard, almost violently. The footsteps seemed to pause, as if whoever or whatever was making them had heard the movement. "We should go," Marcus said firmly. But Sarah was already moving toward the stairwell, the photograph clutched in her free hand. She had to know. After a lifetime of half-truths and family secrets, she finally had a thread to pull. Whatever was down there in the special housing unit, whatever her grandmother had done, it was connected to her. She could feel it in her bones, in the restless movement of her unborn child. The darkness below seemed to pulse with anticipation. The flashlight beam trembled in Sarah's grip as she descended the narrow stone steps, each footfall echoing through the suffocating darkness. The air grew thicker with every step, heavy with decades of accumulated dampness, and something else, something organic and wrong that made her stomach lurch. Behind her, Marcus's breathing came in short, controlled bursts. "Maybe we should come back tomorrow," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "with better equipment, more lights." Sarah paused, one hand instinctively moving to her belly. The baby shifted restlessly, as if responding to her elevated heart rate. For a moment, she considered Marcus's suggestion. The rational part of her mind screamed that a pregnant woman had no business exploring a hidden basement in an abandoned prison, especially not in the dark. But the pull was stronger than reason. Something down here called to her, had been calling since the moment she'd seen that photograph in her grandmother's papers. The woman in the picture looked exactly like her, not similar, not reminiscent, but identical. Same dark hair, same green eyes, same sharp cheekbones. The resemblance was so perfect it defied explanation. "Just a little further," she said, continuing down the steps. "I need to see what's down here." The staircase ended at a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred and warped with age. An old-fashioned key hung from a nail driven into the doorframe, as if someone had left it there deliberately, waiting for the right person to find it. Sarah's fingers closed around the cold metal, and for an instant she could have sworn she felt warmth radiating from it. The key turned with surprising ease, and the door swung open with a prolonged groan. Their flashlight beams revealed a corridor lined with cells, but these were different from the ones upstairs, smaller, cruder. The bars looked hand-forged, and strange symbols had been carved into the stone walls between each cell. Sarah stepped closer to examine the markings, her pulse quickening as she recognized some of them from her grandmother's journals, the same journals she'd barely glanced at before, dismissing them as the ramblings of a lonely old woman. Sarah Marcus's voice was tight with tension. "Look at this!" He stood before the last cell on the right, his flashlight illuminating something that made Sarah's blood run cold. The entire back wall was covered in photographs, dozens of them, spanning what looked like several decades, all women, all bearing the same face. Her face. Sarah approached slowly, her legs suddenly unsteady. The photographs showed women in different clothing, different hairstyles from different eras, but the face was always the same. In some pictures, the women appeared to be pregnant. In others, they held newborn babies. And in a few, they looked terrified, glancing over their shoulders as if being pursued. "This isn't possible," Marcus breathed. "These photos, some of them look like they're from the 1940s, maybe earlier." Sarah studied the images more closely, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The photograph quality, the clothing, the backgrounds, Marcus was right. These spanned decades, possibly even a century. But how could multiple women look so exactly alike, unless they weren't different women at all? The thought hit her like a physical blow, so absurd and terrifying that she almost laughed. But as she stared at the photographs, other details began to emerge. In several images, the woman wore the same necklace, a silver pendant with an unusual symbol that Sarah now recognized as matching the carvings on the walls, and in the background of many photos, she could make out the distinctive architecture of the prison they now stood in. "We need to leave," Marcus said suddenly. "Right now." "Wait." Sarah moved closer to the cell, noticing something else. The lock was different from the others, newer, shinier, and hanging from it was a small brass nameplate that read, "Reserved." The baby kicked hard, so hard that Sarah gasped and doubled over slightly. As she did, her flashlight beam swept across the cell floor, revealing something that made her heart stop. Fresh straw, clean blankets, a pitcher of water that couldn't have been there for more than a few days. "Someone's been here," she whispered. "Recently." That's when they heard it. The sound of footsteps on the stairs above, slow and deliberate. Someone was coming down. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm. "Is there another way out?" She swept her flashlight around frantically, but the corridor was a dead end. The only exit was the way they'd come, and the footsteps were getting closer. The baby kicked again, and this time Sarah felt something else. A strange pulling sensation, as if something invisible was tugging at her from within the reserved cell. The photographs seemed to shimmer in the flashlight beam, and for just a moment she could have sworn she saw her own face staring back at her from every single image. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. The morning light filtering through the grimy windows did nothing to dispel the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over Maya like a shroud. She'd barely slept, her dreams haunted by phantom sounds echoing through empty corridors and the persistent feeling that she was being watched. Now, standing in what had once been the prison's administrative office, she stared at the box of documents Thomas Whitmore had left behind. Her grandmother's handwriting covered page after page, journal entries, letters never sent, and what appeared to be detailed reports about the prison's final years of operation. Maya's hands trembled as she lifted the first yellowed sheet, dated just 3 months before Ravenshallow's official closure in 1987. "The screaming has gotten worse. Dr. Castellanos insists it's merely psychological manifestation of guilt, but I know better. Some doors should never have been opened. Some experiments should never have been conducted. The isolation wing was meant to contain the worst of humanity, but we've created something far worse." Maya set the page aside, her stomach churning. The baby kicked sharply, as if responding to her distress. She pressed a hand to her belly, whispering soothing words that felt hollow in the oppressive silence. The next entry made her blood run cold. "Subject 47 died today. The third one this month. We told their families it was suicide. Easier that way. But I've seen the marks on their necks, the way their eyes bulged with terror. Whatever we've awakened in the deep cells, it's growing stronger. It feeds on fear, on despair. And it's learning. What the hell were you doing here, Grandma?" Maya whispered to the empty room. She flipped through more pages, finding blueprints she'd never seen before, detailed schematics of underground levels that supposedly didn't exist. According to these plans, Ravenshallow extended 3 stories below ground, not the single basement level she'd explored yesterday. The deepest level was marked simply as the oubliette, with a single notation in her grandmother's spidery handwriting, "Where we put the ones who couldn't be broken." A sound from somewhere deep in the prison made Maya freeze. It was distant but unmistakable, the rhythmic clanging of metal against metal, like someone striking bars with a cup or spoon. The sound every prisoner in every movie made when they wanted attention. Maya grabbed her phone, but the screen showed no signal bars. She'd noticed the spotty reception yesterday, but hadn't thought much of it. Now, alone with these horrifying documents, and that persistent metallic rhythm echoing through the walls, the isolation felt suffocating. The sounds stopped abruptly, replaced by something worse, silence so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums. Maya forced herself to breathe steadily, but each exhale sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. She returned to the documents, finding a letter addressed to her mother, dated just weeks before her grandmother's death. "Dearest Sarah, I know you'll never forgive me for what I've done, for the choices I made in the name of science and progress. But you must understand, when you have children, when Maya has children, that some legacies are inherited whether we want them or not. The blood calls to blood, and what we awakened here has been patient, so very patient. If anything happens to me, burn this place to the ground. Don't let Maya come here. Don't let her—" The letter ended abruptly, the pen trailing off as if her grandmother had been interrupted. Maya's hands shook as she set the letter aside. Her mother had never mentioned any of this, had barely spoken of her own mother at all. Now Maya understood why. But understanding brought no comfort, only a growing dread that settled in her bones like winter cold. A new sound drifted through the prison, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the cell blocks. Maya's rational mind insisted it was the old building settling, pipes expanding, any of a dozen mundane explanations. But the footsteps had rhythm, purpose. They were moving closer. She stuffed the most important documents into her bag and crept to the office door. The footsteps had stopped, but she could hear something else now, breathing that wasn't her own, deep and ragged, as if someone was struggling for air. The smart thing would be to leave, get in her car, drive back to the city, sell this cursed place sight unseen. But as she stood there, paralyzed between fear and fascination, she felt the baby move again. A gentle flutter, almost like a response to something only it could sense. Maya thought of her grandmother's words, "The blood calls to blood." Whatever secrets Ravenshollow held, whatever horrors had been committed here, they were part of her heritage now, part of her child's heritage. Running wouldn't change that. It would only leave questions unanswered, wounds unhealed. She stepped into the corridor, her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. Somewhere in the depths below, something was waiting, something that had been waiting for decades, and Maya was going to find it. The basement stretched ahead like a mouth, waiting to swallow her whole. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing crumbling concrete walls and rusted pipes that dripped steadily into puddles of stagnant water. Each step echoed with a hollow clang against the metal grating beneath her feet. She shouldn't be down here. Not alone, not pregnant, not with the baby pressing against her ribs like it was trying to warn her to turn back. But the pull she'd felt since arriving at Blackmore had only grown stronger, and the basement seemed to be its source. The air grew colder as she descended deeper into the bowels of the prison. Her breath misted in front of her face, and she pulled her jacket tighter around her swollen belly. The flashlight's beam wavered as her hands trembled. From cold or fear she couldn't tell anymore. Behind her, somewhere in the darkness above, a door creaked. Sarah froze, listening. Nothing but the steady drip of water and her own ragged breathing. She was imagining things. Had to be. The prison was playing tricks on her mind, making her paranoid. A soft whisper drifted through the air, too faint to make out words but unmistakably human. Sarah spun around, her flashlight cutting wild arcs through the blackness. Empty corridors stretched behind her, shadows dancing at the edges of her vision. "Hello?" Her voice cracked. The whisper didn't come again. She forced herself to continue forward. The basement was a maze of narrow corridors and storage rooms, most of them flooded with several inches of brackish water. Ancient filing cabinets lined one wall, their metal surfaces bloomed with rust. Sarah tried one drawer. It stuck, then gave way suddenly, nearly sending her stumbling backward. Inside were water-damaged papers, the ink long since faded to illegible smears. Another whisper, closer this time. Definitely a woman's voice, speaking words just below the threshold of understanding. The baby kicked hard and Sarah gasped, one hand flying to her belly. It had been still all day, but now it thrashed restlessly, as if responding to something she couldn't sense. Following the sound, she turned down a corridor she hadn't noticed before. It was narrower than the others, barely wide enough for one person. The walls here were different, older stone instead of concrete, and carved with symbols she didn't recognize. Her flashlight beam traced the strange markings, interlocking circles, spirals that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. The corridor ended at a heavy wooden door, its surface black with age. Unlike everything else in the basement, this door showed no signs of decay. The wood was solid, the iron hinges free of rust. A modern deadbolt had been installed, though the key was nowhere to be seen. Sarah pressed her ear to the wood. From beyond came a sound like breathing, slow, rhythmic, patient, waiting. She tried the handle anyway. Locked, of course, but as her fingers wrapped around the cold metal, images flashed through her mind. Her grandmother as a young woman, standing in this same corridor, prisoners in striped uniforms being led through the darkness. Something terrible happening behind this door, something that had been buried and forgotten. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sarah doubled over with a cry of pain. When she straightened, she noticed something she'd missed before, a loose stone in the wall beside the door, newer than the others. She worked it free with her fingernails, feeling around in the cavity behind it. Her fingers closed on cold metal. A key. The whispers grew louder as she slid the key into the lock. Multiple voices now, all female, all speaking in that same urgent undertone. She could almost make out words, her name, warnings, pleas, but the compulsion to open the door was stronger than her fear. Her family's secret was behind this barrier, and she needed to know. The lock turned with surprising ease. The door swung open silently, revealing a small cell that shouldn't have existed. It was warm inside, impossibly warm, and her flashlight beam revealed walls covered in the same strange symbols she'd seen in the corridor. But these were carved deeper, and they seemed to pulse with their own faint light. In the center of the cell sat a woman. She was elderly but not frail, her white hair braided and clean despite the decades of imprisonment. Her clothes were prison grey, but showed no signs of wear or age. She looked up as Sarah entered and smiled with genuine warmth. "Sarah," the woman said, and her voice was exactly what Sarah had been hearing in the whispers. "I've been waiting for you, dear one. Waiting for so very long." The baby went completely still. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her belly, and the woman's gaze followed the gesture. "Yes," she whispered, her smile widening. "You brought me exactly what I need." The door slammed shut behind Sarah with a sound like thunder. The morning sun cast long shadows through the barred windows as Sarah descended into the prison's basement level, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The discovery of the hidden cell had consumed her thoughts through a restless night, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her grandmother had left more than just cryptic journal entries behind. The basement felt different in daylight, if the pale rays filtering through the high windows could be called that. The air was thick with decades of accumulated moisture and decay, making each breath feel heavy in her lungs. Her footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as she made her way toward the section where she'd found the concealed door. The cell door stood slightly ajar, just as she'd left it. Sarah pushed it open wider, wincing at the metallic groan that seemed to reverberate through the entire foundation. Inside, her flashlight beam revealed details she'd missed in her panicked flight the night before. Scratches covered every surface. Walls, floor, even the ceiling where desperate fingers had somehow reached. But these weren't random marks. As Sarah moved closer, patterns emerged. Dates carved deep into the stone, some so old they were barely legible. Names, too, dozens of them, overlapping and intertwining like a twisted family tree. Her heart stopped when she found her grandmother's name among them. Eleanor Blackwood, 1952, but that was impossible. Her grandmother would have been barely 16 then, and according to family stories, she hadn't inherited the prison until the 1960s. Sarah traced the carved letters with trembling fingers. The groove was deep, deliberate, as if someone had spent considerable time etching each stroke. Beside Eleanor's name was another that made her blood run cold, Margaret Blackwood, 1923. Margaret, her great-grandmother, who had supposedly died in childbirth. The baby kicked sharply, as if responding to Sarah's rising anxiety. She pressed her free hand to her belly, trying to calm both herself and the child within. "It's okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to her baby or herself. Moving deeper into the cell, Sarah's light caught something metallic in the far corner. A small, tarnished box sat partially hidden beneath years of accumulated debris. She knelt carefully, her pregnancy making the movement awkward, and brushed away the grime. The box was ornate, clearly old, with intricate engravings that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering flashlight beam. The lock had long since corroded away, and the lid opened with surprising ease. Inside, wrapped in what had once been white cloth, lay a collection of items that made no immediate sense. A small silver locket, several yellowed photographs, and what appeared to be medical instruments, though their purpose was unclear and deeply unsettling. Sarah lifted the locket first, her hands shaking as she opened it. The photograph inside showed a woman who looked remarkably like her grandmother, but the clothing and hairstyle were clearly from an earlier era. On the opposite side was an image of a baby, its features somehow wrong, though Sarah couldn't quite identify what disturbed her about it. The photographs were even more disturbing. They showed women in various stages of pregnancy, all bearing the distinctive Blackwood features Sarah recognized from her own mirror, but their faces held an expression of terror that transcended the limitations of the old camera equipment. In several images, the women appeared to be restrained, and in others, they were clearly inside this very prison. Her grandmother's journal had mentioned a family duty, but this suggested something far more sinister than Sarah had imagined. The dates on the photographs spanned decades, 1899, 1923, 1952, and others. A pattern emerged, roughly every generation, sometimes twice within a generation. The medical instruments made her stomach churn. They were clearly designed for obstetric use, but their crude construction and the dark stains that had survived decades suggested procedures that were anything but routine medical care. As Sarah examined each item, a horrible understanding began to take shape. This wasn't just a family inheritance, it was a family tradition. Women were brought here, pregnant women, and something was done to them. Something that required isolation, restraint, and secrecy. The baby moved again, more urgently this time, and Sarah felt a sharp pain across her abdomen. She'd been crouching for too long, but as she tried to stand, the pain intensified. It wasn't the baby's movement, it was something else. The flashlight flickered, and in the momentary darkness, Sarah could have sworn she heard breathing that wasn't her own. When the light steadied, shadows seemed to move independently of her movements, reaching toward her with fingers of darkness. She needed to get out of here, needed fresh air and sunlight, and distance from whatever evil had taken root in this place. But as she turned toward the door, the pain struck again, doubling her over. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. And somewhere in the darkness beyond her failing flashlight beam, Sarah heard what sounded distinctly like a baby crying. The basement stretched before Sarah like a mouth full of broken teeth. Each step down the concrete stairs sent vibrations through her swollen belly, and she pressed one hand protectively against the movement within. The flashlight beam danced across walls that wept with decades of moisture, revealing patches of mold that resembled dark bruises. Marcus followed close behind, his breathing shallow in the stifling air. "Sarah, maybe we should—" "No." Her voice cut through the darkness with surprising firmness. "I need to see what's down here, what she was hiding." The basement was larger than she'd expected, stretching beyond the reach of her flashlight. Ancient pipes snaked across the ceiling like metal intestines, occasionally dripping condensation that echoed in the hollow space. But it was the wall that made her stop breathing. Someone had covered nearly every inch of the far wall with photographs, newspaper clippings, and documents. Red string connected various pieces like a spider's web, creating a chaotic map of obsession that made Sarah's skin crawl. She approached slowly, her light revealing the true scope of her grandmother's fixation. The photographs were old, some dating back to what looked like the 1940s and 50s. Prison mugshots mostly, showing gaunt-faced inmates with hollow eyes. But scattered among them were family photos, images Sarah recognized of her mother as a child, of relatives she'd never met, and disturbingly, several photos of Sarah herself from various stages of her life. "How did she get these?" Sarah whispered, pointing to a photo of herself from high school graduation. "We hadn't spoken in years." Marcus leaned closer, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. "She was watching you. This whole time, she was watching." The newspaper clippings told a different story than the official records upstairs. Headlines screamed about unexplained deaths at Blackmore Prison, about inmates found dead in their cells with no signs of violence. One article from 1953 bore the headline, "Seventh Mysterious Death Rocks Blackmore. Warden Calls for Investigation." But it was the handwritten notes that made Sarah's blood run cold. Her grandmother's spidery handwriting covered margins and connected photos with increasingly erratic observations. The hunger grows stronger with each generation. Sarah carries the blood. She must not know. It waits for her return. "Marcus, look at this." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper as she illuminated a section of documents that made her knees weak. Birth certificates, death certificates, medical records, all bearing the same family name, Blackmore. Not her mother's maiden name as she'd been told, but her actual family lineage. The documents revealed a bloodline stretching back to the prison's founding, with her great-great-grandfather listed as the original warden. "My grandmother lied about everything," Sarah said, her free hand trembling as she traced the family tree someone had drawn in red ink. "We didn't just inherit this place, we built it. We've always been connected to it." The baby kicked hard, as if responding to her distress, and Sarah doubled over slightly. When she straightened, her light caught something that made her gasp. A section of the wall had been covered with medical drawings, anatomical sketches that looked like they belonged in a Victorian textbook. But these weren't studying normal human anatomy. The drawings showed something else entirely. Figures with elongated limbs, distended mouths full of needle-sharp teeth, and what appeared to be a secondary nervous system running parallel to the spine like a parasitic vine. Beneath the drawings, in her grandmother's handwriting, the transformation begins in the womb. Each generation, it grows stronger. Sarah's child will be the first born with the full awakening. "We're leaving." Marcus grabbed her arm, his voice tight with panic. "Right now, we're getting out of here and never coming back." But Sarah couldn't move. Something about the drawings called to her, made terrible sense in a way she couldn't explain. The kicks inside her womb felt different now, not like a baby moving, but like something trying to claw its way out. "Sarah!" Marcus's voice seemed to come from very far away. "The temperature, it's dropping." He was right. Their breath was beginning to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and something else was happening. The photographs on the wall were moving, not physically, but the faces in them were changing, mouths opening in silent screams, eyes tracking their movement. From somewhere above them came a sound that made them both freeze. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the floor of the prison, accompanied by something else, a dragging sound, like chains. Sarah's flashlight flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. In the silence that followed, she heard Marcus's sharp intake of breath and felt his hand grip hers desperately. Then, from the darkness above, came a voice she recognized, her grandmother's voice, impossible though it was. "Sarah," it called, sweet as poisoned honey. "Come home, darling. It's time you learned the truth about what you're carrying." The basement air grew thicker as Sarah descended the crumbling stone steps, each footfall echoing through the darkness like a heartbeat. The flashlight beam cut through the shadows, revealing walls that wept with decades of moisture and despair. Behind her, Marcus's breathing came in short bursts, his earlier bravado replaced by something approaching terror. "Sarah, we should go back," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant dripping of water. "Whatever's down here, it's been sealed for a reason." But Sarah couldn't stop. The pull she'd felt upstairs had intensified, drawing her forward like a tide she couldn't resist. The baby kicked restlessly in her womb, as if sensing her mounting anxiety. Each step brought fresh waves of that metallic taste to her mouth, and with it, flashes of memories that couldn't possibly be her own. A woman's scream, iron bars slamming shut, the sound of something wet hitting stone. The corridor stretched endlessly before them, lined with cells whose doors hung open like broken jaws. Sarah's flashlight swept across rusted hinges and rotting wood, illuminating scratches in the walls that looked disturbingly like claw marks. The air carried an undertone of something organic and wrong, not quite decay, but close. "Look at this!" Marcus called softly from behind her. Sarah turned to find him examining a series of photographs mounted on the wall, their frames somehow intact despite the basement's decay. The images were old, sepia-toned portraits of women in Victorian dress, but as Sarah studied them closer, her blood turned to ice. They all had her face. Not similar features or family resemblances, her exact face, down to the small scar above her left eyebrow and the peculiar way her right eye sat slightly higher than her left. The clothing and hairstyles changed with each generation, but the face remained constant, unchanging, impossible. "This isn't possible," Marcus breathed, his flashlight beam trembling across the photographs. "Sarah, what the hell is this place?" Before she could answer, a sound echoed from the depths of the corridor, a rhythmic scraping, like fingernails dragging across stone. It came in measured intervals, deliberate and patient. Sarah's grandmother's words echoed in her memory. "Some hungers can wait decades to be fed." The scraping stopped. Sarah's flashlight began to flicker, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. In those brief moments of darkness between the strobing light, she glimpsed something that made her heart stutter. A figure standing at the far end of the corridor, perfectly still, watching them. When the light steadied, nothing was there. "We need to leave, now." Marcus grabbed her arm, but Sarah shook him off. "I have to see," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Whatever's down here, it's connected to me, to my family. I can't run from it anymore." The baby kicked harder, and for a moment Sarah felt something else. A presence that wasn't entirely her own consciousness. Old memories bleeding through, carrying with them the weight of generations. She saw herself, or someone wearing her face, standing in this same corridor decades ago. The woman was pregnant too, her belly swollen with promise and dread. "You came back," a voice whispered from the darkness ahead. It sounded like wind through broken glass, ancient and patient. "They always come back when the time is right." Sarah's flashlight illuminated a door at the corridor's end, different from the others. This one was made of iron, thick and imposing, with symbols carved into its surface that seemed to writhe in the shifting light. The door stood slightly ajar, and from the gap seeped a darkness so complete it seemed to devour the flashlight beam. "Sarah, don't!" Marcus's voice cracked with panic. "Please, whatever's in there." But she was already moving, drawn forward by a compulsion that felt older than memory. The iron door was warm to the touch, almost feverish, and as she pushed it open, the temperature dropped noticeably. Her breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. The cell beyond was small and windowless, its walls covered in the same photographs she'd seen in the corridor, hundreds of them showing the same face across centuries of time. In the center of the room sat a chair, its wood dark with age and stains that could have been blood or something worse. Sitting in the chair was a woman. She had Sarah's face, but her skin was pale as parchment, and her eyes held depths that spoke of unnatural longevity. She wore a dress that might have been white once, now yellowed with age. Her hands, folded in her lap, ended in fingernails grown long and sharp. When she smiled, Sarah saw that her teeth had been filed to points. "Hello, granddaughter," the woman said, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "I've been waiting so very long for you to come home. We have so much to discuss about the baby you're carrying." The basement descended farther than Elena had imagined possible. Each step on the rusted metal staircase sent vibrations through her swollen belly, and she pressed one hand protectively against her stomach while gripping the deteriorating handrail with the other. The air grew thicker with each level, heavy with decades of moisture and something else, something organic and sweet that made her gag. Marcus followed close behind, his flashlight beam dancing across crumbling concrete walls marked with strange symbols. They weren't graffiti from former inmates. These marks were older, deeper, carved with deliberate precision into the foundation itself. Elena recognized some of the patterns from her grandmother's journal, though she still couldn't decipher their meaning. "How deep does this go?" Marcus whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the narrow stairwell. Elena paused at what appeared to be the bottom level, where a heavy steel door waited. Unlike the other barriers they'd encountered, this one showed no signs of rust or decay. The metal gleamed dully in their flashlight beams, as if it had been recently maintained. A small window, no bigger than her palm, was set into the center at eye level. "This is it," she said, though she wasn't sure how she knew. The certainty came from somewhere deep inside her, the same instinctive knowledge that had led her to the hidden staircase. Marcus reached for the handle, but Elena caught his wrist. "Wait." She approached the small window and peered through the thick glass. The space beyond was larger than she'd expected. Not a cell, but a chamber. Candles flickered along the walls, their flames steady despite the absence of any visible air current. The sight of fresh flames in this abandoned place sent ice through her veins. "Someone's been here recently," she breathed. "That's impossible. The place has been sealed for—" A sound from within the chamber cut him off, not quite human, but not entirely animal either, a low, rhythmic breathing that seemed to pulse in time with Elena's heartbeat. She pressed closer to the window, straining to see into the shadowed corners. That's when she saw her. The woman sat in the center of the chamber, perfectly still, her back to the door. Long grey hair fell in tangled waves down her shoulders, and she wore what looked like a simple white dress, though it was stained with substances Elena didn't want to identify. But it was the woman's posture that made Elena's blood freeze, the unnatural stillness, the way her head tilted at an angle that suggested either death or something far worse. "Grandmother?" The word escaped Elena's lips before she could stop it. The woman's head began to turn, a slow rotation that defied anatomy. When she completed the movement, Elena found herself staring into eyes she recognized from old family photographs, her grandmother's eyes, but changed. The irises had faded to a milky white, and something moved beneath the surface, like worms writhing under ice. Marcus grabbed Elena's shoulder, trying to pull her away from the window, but she couldn't move. The woman in the chamber, her grandmother, somehow impossibly alive despite having died 5 years ago, smiled. Her teeth had grown longer, sharper, and her tongue flicked out like a serpent tasting the air. "You came back to me, child," the thing that had been her grandmother said, its voice carrying clearly through the steel door. "I've been waiting so long, keeping myself fed, keeping myself strong, all for this moment." Elena's hand moved instinctively to her belly. "The baby," she whispered. "3 generations of power," her grandmother continued, rising from her seated position with movements that seemed to flow rather than step. "Your mother tried to break the cycle, tried to run from what we are. But blood calls to blood, Elena. The gift always returns home." Marcus finally succeeded in pulling Elena away from the window, but her grandmother's laughter followed them. "You can't leave, dear one. The prison was built around me, not to keep me in, but to keep others out, to keep our family's work protected until you were ready." "What work?" Elena called back, despite Marcus's attempts to drag her toward the stairs. the feeding child, the sustaining, each generation stronger than the last. Her grandmother's face appeared at the window now, pressed against the glass from the other side. "Your baby will be the most powerful yet. But first you must let me out. The door only opens from your side and only for family blood." Elena stared at the simple handle on their side of the door. No lock, no complex mechanism. Just a choice. "Elena, we're leaving. Now." Marcus's voice carried desperate authority. But as they climbed the stairs, Elena felt something shifting inside her womb. Not the usual flutter of movement, but something deliberate and purposeful. Something that seemed to respond to its great-grandmother's presence. Behind them, the laughter echoed through the stairwell, no longer entirely human. The temperature in the hidden chamber had dropped so drastically that Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs. The baby moved restlessly inside her, and she pressed a protective hand to her belly as she approached the ancient cell door. The iron bars were thick with rust, but something had been scratching at them recently. Fresh metal shavings glinted on the stone floor. Detective Morrison's flashlight beam swept across the walls, revealing more of the grotesque symbols carved into every surface. They seemed to pulse in the shifting light, and Sarah had to look away when they began to make her dizzy. The smell of decay was overwhelming here, mixed with something else, something that reminded her of the way the air tasted before a violent thunderstorm. "These markings," Dr. Reeves whispered, her voice trembling as she traced one with her finger. "I've seen similar ones in my research, but never this elaborate. This is a complete containment system." "Containment for what?" Morrison demanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. Sarah knew they could all feel it now, the presence that had been calling to her since she'd first set foot in Greystone. It was stronger here, more focused, and it was awake. The scratching sound started again, coming from inside the cell, metal against stone, rhythmic and purposeful. Sarah's grandmother's journal had mentioned the scratching, described how it had driven the guards mad in the final months before the prison was abandoned. But Elizabeth had never explained what was making the sound. "We should leave," Morrison said, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon. "Whatever this is, we're not equipped to handle it." But Sarah couldn't move. The baby was kicking now, more violently than ever before, and she could feel something else, a warmth spreading through her body that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. It was the same sensation she'd felt when touching the brass key, but magnified tenfold. "It knows we're here," she said quietly. The scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, they could hear something else, breathing that wasn't quite human, coming from the deepest shadows of the cell. Dr. Reeves aimed her flashlight into the darkness, and they all saw it at the same time. The figure hunched in the far corner was impossibly tall and thin, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. What had once been clothing hung in tatters from its skeletal frame, and its skin was the color of old parchment. But it was the eyes that made Sarah's blood freeze. They were Elizabeth's eyes, her grandmother's eyes, staring out from a face that was both ancient and eternally young. "Sarah," the thing whispered, and its voice was like wind through dead leaves. "My sweet granddaughter, you came back to me." Morrison raised his gun, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely aim. "What the hell is that thing?" Sarah knew, even though her mind recoiled from the knowledge. The journal entries had hinted at it, the villagers' stories had danced around it, but seeing it with her own eyes made everything horribly clear. Her grandmother hadn't just been the prison's warden, she had been its prisoner. "Elizabeth," Sarah breathed. The creature that had once been her grandmother smiled, revealing teeth that had grown long and sharp over the decades. "I've been waiting so long, child, waiting for you to inherit more than just this place. The bloodline must continue." The baby kicked again, and Sarah gasped as she felt something shift inside her, not the normal movement of pregnancy, but something else awakening. The warmth in her body was spreading, changing, and she could feel her heartbeat synchronizing with the slow, deliberate pulse that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the chamber. "The family gift," Elizabeth continued, her voice growing stronger. "It skipped your mother. She was too weak, too ordinary. But you, I can smell it in your blood. And the child you carry." Her eyes fixed on Sarah's swollen belly. "The child will be perfect." Dr. Reeves was backing toward the passage, her face white with terror. "Sarah, we need to go, now." But Elizabeth's gaze held Sarah frozen in place. "You feel it, don't you? The hunger, the need to feed, to grow stronger. It's been building in you since you arrived. Every death in this place, every scream that echoed through these halls. It's all part of you now." Sarah tried to deny it, but she couldn't. The warmth inside her was no longer unfamiliar. It was intoxicating. She could sense the life force of her companions, could almost taste their fear and confusion, and underneath it all, the baby's presence burned like a small star, growing brighter with each passing moment. "Join me," Elizabeth whispered, extending one impossibly long arm toward the bars. "Let me teach you what you really are, what we've always been." The key in Sarah's pocket began to burn against her skin, and she knew with absolute certainty that it would open this cell, that it had always been meant to open this cell. The question was whether she would use it to free her grandmother or find another way to end this nightmare forever. The basement stretched endlessly before Sarah, its walls weeping with decades of moisture and neglect. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a corridor she'd never seen before, hidden behind what had appeared to be a solid concrete wall. The opening gaped like a wound, edges jagged where the false barrier had crumbled away during her desperate escape from whatever had been pursuing her upstairs. Her breathing still came in ragged gasps, and the baby kicked frantically against her ribs, as if sensing the malevolent presence that seemed to permeate these hidden depths. The air down here was different, thicker, older, carrying the metallic taste of rust, and something else she couldn't identify, something organic and wrong. Each step echoed hollowly as she moved deeper into the passage. The walls were lined with pipes that hadn't seen maintenance in decades, their surfaces covered in a film that made her skin crawl. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness ahead, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. She shouldn't be down here. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to flee the prison entirely and never return. But the journal pages tucked inside her jacket pressed against her chest, a constant reminder of the questions that needed answers. Her grandmother's confession about the experiments, about what they'd done to the prisoners, about what had been created in this place. It all led here. The corridor branched ahead, splitting into 3 different paths. Sarah paused, consulting the crude map her grandmother had sketched on the journal's final page. The middle passage, marked with symbols she didn't recognize, seemed to be her destination. As she turned the flashlight beam toward it, something glittered on the floor. Keys, old-fashioned brass keys on a ring, tarnished black with age. They looked like they'd been dropped recently, despite their obvious antiquity. Sarah picked them up with trembling fingers, noting how cold they felt against her palm, colder than the ambient temperature could account for. The middle passage sloped downward, taking her deeper beneath the prison than she'd thought possible. The ceiling lowered until she had to duck slightly, and the walls seemed to press inward. Pipes gave way to bare rock, as if this section had been carved directly from the earth rather than constructed. Then she saw the door. It stood at the end of the passage like a monument to forgotten horrors. Solid steel, unmarked by rust despite the moisture that pervaded everything else down here. No window, no marking, except for a small slot at eye level that had been welded shut. The lock was massive, old-fashioned, waiting for the keys now burning cold in her hand. Sarah approached slowly, every nerve screaming warnings she chose to ignore. This was what her grandmother had hidden, what the family had kept secret for generations, what had been waiting in the darkness for her return. The first key didn't fit, neither did the second, but the third slid home with a click that seemed to echo through dimensions. The lock turned with surprising ease, and the door swung open on hinges that should have been frozen with age, but moved as if recently oiled. The smell hit her first, antiseptic and decay mingled with something that made her gorge rise. Then her flashlight beam revealed the contents of the cell, and Sarah's world tilted on its axis. It wasn't a cell, it was a laboratory. Equipment lined the walls, some recognizable, much of it alien in purpose. Restraint tables stood in the center, stained with substances she didn't want to identify. Charts covered one wall, showing anatomical drawings that weren't quite human, with measurements and notes scrawled in her grandmother's handwriting. But it was the tank against the far wall that made Sarah's blood freeze. Large enough to hold a person, filled with murky fluid that seemed to move independently of any external force. Tubes and wires snaked into its depths, connecting to machinery that hummed with a low electrical charge. And floating inside, barely visible through the clouded liquid, was a shape that might once have been human. Sarah stepped closer despite every instinct telling her to run. The shape became clearer, and she realized with growing horror that it was watching her. Eyes, too many eyes, tracked her movement through the fluid. What had once been a mouth opened and closed silently, revealing rows of teeth that belonged to no earthly creature. A plaque at the base of the tank bore a name and date. Subject 1A, Maternal Line Enhancement Protocol. Duration, 47 years. The baby inside Sarah's womb kicked violently, and suddenly she understood. The dreams that had been plaguing her, the voices in the walls, the way the prison seemed to call to her. It wasn't coincidence, it wasn't inheritance. It was summoning. The thing in the tank pressed against the glass, its malformed features arranging themselves into something like a smile. And in its movement, Sarah saw a horrible familiarity, a genetic echo that made her touch her own face in dawning terror. Behind her, the door slammed shut with a sound like a coffin lid closing. The basement stretched deeper than Sarah had imagined, the flashlight beam barely penetrating the oppressive darkness ahead. Each step down the rusted metal stairs sent echoes bouncing off unseen walls, and the air grew thicker with every breath. The smell hit her first, decay mixed with something medicinal, like old antiseptic trying to mask something far worse. Marcus stayed close behind her, his hand occasionally touching her shoulder for reassurance. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered, though the silence seemed to demand hushed tones. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure of anything anymore. The hidden passage behind the bookshelf in her grandmother's office had revealed stairs leading to what the prison blueprints never showed, a sub-basement that officially didn't exist. The journal entries she'd found suggested this was where the real experiments had taken place, away from prying eyes and official records. The stairs ended at a narrow corridor lined with doors, each bearing a small observation window. Sarah's flashlight revealed the first few cells, empty now, but the scratches on the walls told stories of desperation. Numbers were painted on each door, but they didn't follow the prison's numbering system. These were different, clinical. "Room 7, Sarah murmured, remembering the journal entry that had sent chills down her spine. Her grandmother had written about Room 7 with a mixture of fear and fascination, describing it as the place where the breakthrough finally happened. They moved methodically down the corridor, counting doors. The baby kicked hard against Sarah's ribs, as if responding to the oppressive atmosphere. She pressed her hand to her belly, whispering softly, "It's okay, little one. We're almost done here." Room 7's door stood slightly ajar, unlike the others which were sealed shut. Sarah's hand trembled as she pushed it open, the hinges protesting with a groan that seemed to go on forever. The room beyond was larger than the others, more laboratory than cell. Surgical equipment covered in decades of dust lined one wall, while restraint tables occupied the center. But it was the far wall that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was covered floor to ceiling with photographs and documents, a grotesque family tree that traced back generations. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed, stepping up beside her. The photographs showed women, all bearing a striking resemblance to Sarah, all visibly pregnant. Names and dates were written beneath each image, spanning nearly a century. At the center of it all was a large portrait of her grandmother as a young woman, her hand resting on her swollen belly. Sarah's flashlight caught something else, a thick ledger sitting open on a desk, its pages yellowed with age. She approached it carefully, Marcus keeping watch at the door. The entries were in her grandmother's handwriting, but younger, more excited. They detailed experiments involving pregnant women, injections of an unknown substance, and monitoring of fetal development. "The bloodline must remain pure," Sarah read aloud from one entry, "each generation stronger than the last. The entity requires vessels of specific genetic markers, and our family has been chosen to provide them." The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sarah gasped at the intensity. As she did, she noticed something that made her stomach lurch. The most recent photograph on the wall was of her mother, pregnant and strapped to one of the examination tables. The date written beneath it was exactly 9 months before Sarah's birth. "We need to leave. Now." Marcus's voice was urgent, but Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the wall. "Look at the dates, Marcus. Every woman in my family, for 4 generations, gave birth in this place. They were all brought here when they were pregnant. That doesn't mean—" A sound from the corridor cut him off, the slow, deliberate clang of metal on metal, like footsteps on the stairs they'd just descended. Sarah clicked off the flashlight immediately, plunging them into absolute darkness. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by something else, a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. Sarah recognized the tune. It was the same lullaby her grandmother used to sing to her during those brief childhood visits. "There's another way out," Sarah whispered, remembering a second door at the far end of the room. They felt their way along the wall, guided only by memory and desperation. Behind them, the footsteps stopped at the threshold of room 7. A voice, unmistakably her grandmother's despite the decades since she'd heard it, drifted through the darkness. "Sarah, dear child, you've come home at last. The family reunion can finally begin." The baby kicked one more time, and Sarah felt something else, a warmth spreading through her abdomen, and with it the horrible realization that whatever had been waiting in this place wasn't just connected to her family's past. It was connected to her unborn child, and it had been patiently waiting for exactly this moment to complete whatever dark purpose had been set in motion generations ago. The iron door slammed shut behind Elena with a finality that made her stomach lurch. The sound echoed through the hidden cell, bouncing off walls that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent heartbeat. She pressed her palms against the cold metal, feeling for any mechanism that might release her, but found only smooth, unyielding surface. "Let me out!" Her voice cracked as she pounded against the door. The baby kicked frantically in response to her panic, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them both. Silence answered her pleas. Elena turned to face the cell that had claimed her, just as it had claimed her grandmother decades before. The space was larger than she'd initially realized, stretching back into shadows that seemed to move independent of any light source. Ancient symbols covered every inch of the walls, the same twisted sigils she'd seen throughout the prison, but here they were carved deeper, more deliberately. Some still bore dark stains that she didn't want to identify. In the center of the far wall stood an altar of blackened stone, its surface worn smooth by countless rituals. Chains hung from iron rings embedded in the corners, their links stained with rust and worse. But it was what lay upon the altar that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. A leather-bound journal, identical to her grandmother's, lay open to pages covered in familiar handwriting. Beside it rested a ceremonial dagger, its blade etched with the same symbols that adorned the walls. The metal seemed to drink in what little light filtered through the ventilation grates above, creating an absence of illumination that hurt to look at directly. Elena approached slowly, her feet moving against her will as if drawn by some invisible force. The journal's pages fluttered despite the absence of any breeze, revealing entry after entry written in her grandmother's careful script. But these weren't the desperate confessions she'd read before. These words pulsed with purpose, with dark knowledge willingly embraced. "The bloodline must continue," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "Each generation must offer themselves willingly, or the compact will be broken. The entity that sleeps beneath our foundation requires a living vessel, one born of our flesh, one who carries the mark." A hand moved instinctively to her swollen belly. The mark, the birthmark she'd always assumed was merely genetic, a port wine stain that ran along her left shoulder in a pattern that now, in this cursed place, she recognized as matching the central sigil carved into the altar before her. The pages continued to turn of their own accord, revealing the true history of her family's legacy. Her grandmother hadn't been a victim trapped in this place. She'd been the willing guardian of something ancient and hungry. For 40 years she'd fed it with the life force of the prisoners who died within these walls, sustaining it until a proper vessel could be born. "No," Elena breathed, backing away from the altar. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But even as she spoke the words, she felt the truth settling into her bones like ice. The dreams that had plagued her pregnancy, visions of dark water and grasping hands, the way the baby moved inside her, not with the random kicks of a developing child, but with purpose, as if responding to signals she couldn't perceive, the irresistible pull she'd felt toward this place from the moment she'd learned of her inheritance. The walls began to weep. Dark fluid seeped from the carved symbols, trickling down the stone in patterns that formed new sigils, new words in a language that predated human speech. The air grew thick and oppressive, carrying the stench of decay and something far worse, the smell of anticipation, of hunger finally about to be satisfied. From somewhere deep below the cell, a sound began to rise. Not quite a heartbeat, not quite breathing, but something that contained elements of both. The rhythm matched the frantic beating of Elena's own heart, and she realized with growing horror that it was synchronizing with the movements of the child within her womb. The journal's pages stopped turning, settling on a final entry dated the day before her grandmother's supposed death. The words seemed to burn themselves into Elena's vision. "She is coming. The vessel approaches. At last my vigil can end, and the true work can begin. The child will be born in darkness, and in darkness it will serve. The family curse becomes the family blessing. May forgiveness find me in the void." The sound from below grew louder, more insistent. The walls trembled with each pulse, and cracks began to appear in the floor beneath Elena's feet. Through the fissures, she glimpsed something that made her mind recoil, a vast space filled with writhing shadows and eyes that reflected no light. Her water broke. The timing couldn't be coincidental. As the warm fluid pooled around her feet, the symbols on the walls blazed with sickly phosphorescence. The entity below sensed its moment had arrived. Elena gripped the altar's edge as the first contraction seized her, knowing with absolute certainty that she was about to give birth to something that was no longer entirely human. The screaming had stopped, but Elena could still hear its echo reverberating through the stone corridors as she pressed herself against the cold wall. Her grandmother's journal trembled in her hands, the final entry still burning in her mind like acid. "The child must complete what I could not. The binding weakens with each generation, and only blood can renew it." Marcus appeared at the end of the hallway, his face pale in the flickering light of their dying flashlight. "The entire east wing is collapsing," he whispered. "Whatever you did down there." "I didn't do anything," Elena cut him off, though even as she spoke, she could feel the change within her. The baby had gone completely still, and there was something else now, a presence that felt ancient and hungry. "We need to get out of here." But even as she said it, she knew they couldn't leave. Not yet. The journal's final pages had revealed the truth about her family's guardianship of this place, about the thing that had been bound here for over a century. Her great-great-grandmother had been the first, luring the entity into the hidden cell with promises of power, then sealing it away with a ritual that demanded a terrible price. A price that had been passed down through generations of women in her family. The walls around them began to weep, not water, but something dark and viscous that smelled of copper and decay. Marcus grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the main corridor. "Elena, we have to go now." She let him guide her, but her mind was elsewhere, processing the horrifying revelation that had been waiting in her grandmother's careful script. The entity wasn't just imprisoned here, it was bound to their bloodline, feeding off each generation to maintain its strength. And now, with Elena pregnant, it sensed an opportunity for something more. They reached the main entrance just as the building shuddered violently. Chunks of masonry crashed down behind them, and Elena could swear she heard something laughing in the destruction. The heavy wooden door, which had seemed so solid when they'd entered, now hung crooked on its hinges. "The car," Marcus said. But Elena wasn't listening. She was staring back into the depths of the prison, where a pale light had begun to emanate from somewhere deep within. The light pulsed with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, and she realized with growing horror that it wasn't coincidence. "It's not trying to escape," she whispered. "It's trying to be born." The journal slipped from her numb fingers, falling open to a page she hadn't noticed before. In her grandmother's shaking handwriting, "The 7th generation will birth the vessel. What was bound will be flesh. What was hunger will be human." Marcus followed her gaze to the open page, his face draining of color as he read. "Elena, you're the 7th generation." The baby moved then, a violent thrashing that doubled her over with pain. But it wasn't natural movement. It felt wrong, purposeful, as if something else was directing the motion. She pressed her hands to her swollen belly and felt something that made her blood freeze, a response that wasn't from her child. Something else was in there with the baby. "No," she gasped, understanding flooding through her like ice water. The entity hadn't been waiting for her to free it. It had been waiting for her to carry it. The ritual that bound it hadn't been a prison, it had been preparation, seasoning her bloodline over generations to create the perfect vessel. The pale light from within the prison grew brighter, and now Elena could see shapes moving in it. Not shadows, but absences of light, as if reality itself was being eaten away. The thing that had pretended to be trapped was revealing its true nature, and she finally understood why her grandmother had stayed away, why she'd tried to let the family line end with her. Marcus was pulling at her arm again, shouting something about the car, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. The pain in her abdomen was spreading, changing, becoming something that felt less like pregnancy and more like transformation. She could feel her child's heartbeat, rapid and frightened, and beneath it something else entirely, something ancient that beat with the patient rhythm of centuries. "The keys," she managed to say, pressing the car keys into Marcus's hand. "Drive away. Don't stop. Don't come back. I'm not leaving you." "You have to." She looked into his eyes, and he must have seen something there that terrified him because he stepped back. "It's not just me anymore, and when it's born—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the horrible understanding that her grandmother's journal had given her. The entity hadn't been imprisoned for a century, it had been incubating, and now, finally, it was ready to be born into the world. The creature's screams echoed through the prison corridors as Sarah stumbled backward. Her grandmother's journal clutched against her chest. The pages had revealed everything: the failed experiments, the twisted rituals, the thing that had once been her grandfather twisted into something monstrous by her grandmother's desperate attempts to cheat death. "You have to complete what she started," Marcus said, stepping closer. His face was pale, drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with an unsettling fervor. "The ritual isn't finished. That's why it's been waiting all these years." Sarah shook her head, bile rising in her throat. "You're insane." I can't." "You're carrying the next generation," he interrupted, his gaze dropping to her swollen belly. "The bloodline has to continue. Your grandmother knew this day would come. She prepared for it." The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if responding to his words. Sarah winced, one hand moving protectively over her stomach. Something was wrong, had been wrong since she'd first entered this cursed place. The pregnancy symptoms that had plagued her for months had intensified, and strange new sensations coursed through her body. Another inhuman wail drifted up from the depths below, closer now. The thing was moving, climbing. "We need to get out of here," Sarah gasped, backing toward the exit. But Marcus blocked her path, and behind him stood two other figures she hadn't noticed before: a woman with silver hair and cold eyes, and a man whose face was half hidden in shadow. "There is no leaving," the woman said softly. "Not until the work is complete. Your grandmother spent decades perfecting the process, learning from her mistakes. You are the culmination of everything she worked toward. Sarah's blood ran cold as she recognized the woman's voice. She'd heard it before, in nightmares that had plagued her since childhood. "Who are you?" "I'm your great-aunt Helena," the woman replied with a thin smile. "Your grandmother's sister. I've been waiting here, keeping watch, ensuring that everything would be ready for your arrival." The sound of scraping metal echoed from below, followed by a crash that shook the entire building. Dust rained from the ceiling as something massive moved through the lower levels. "It knows you're here," Helena continued. "It can sense the child you carry. The bloodline calls to it." Sarah's mind reeled as the pieces fell into place. The inheritance wasn't random, it was planned. The journal, the timing, even her pregnancy. It had all been orchestrated. "My husband," she whispered. "David, what have you done with him?" Marcus exchanged a glance with Helena. "He's safe, for now, but his safety depends on your cooperation." A new wave of pain lanced through Sarah's abdomen, doubling her over. The baby was moving frantically now, as if trying to escape. She gasped, tasting copper in her mouth. "It's beginning," Helena said with satisfaction. "The child knows its purpose. Your grandmother's blood runs strong in both of you." Sarah straightened with effort, her vision blurring at the edges. "What do you want from me?" "The same thing your grandmother wanted," Helena replied. "To break the barrier between life and death, to achieve true immortality, but she was too hasty, too eager. The vessel she chose, your grandfather, wasn't strong enough. The transformation was incomplete." Another crash echoed from below, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps on metal stairs. "But you," Helena continued, her eyes gleaming, "you carry the perfect vessel, a child conceived in innocence but born into power. The ritual will work this time." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as understanding dawned. They didn't just want her, they wanted her unborn child. The baby she'd been preparing to love and protect was meant to be a sacrifice, a host for whatever dark purpose her grandmother had been pursuing. "Never," she snarled, maternal instinct flaring to life despite her terror. "I'll die before I let you touch my baby." Helena's smile widened. "Death isn't the end, dear child. Your grandmother proved that. Soon you'll understand." The footsteps were louder now, accompanied by a rhythmic scraping sound. Something was ascending the stairs with deliberate purpose. The air grew thick and oppressive, filled with the stench of decay and something else, something chemical and wrong. Sarah looked around frantically, seeking an escape route. The corridor stretched in both directions, but she could see more figures emerging from the shadows at either end. They'd been waiting, watching, preparing for this moment. Her hand moved to the small knife she'd found earlier, still tucked into her belt. It wouldn't be much against whatever was coming, but she wouldn't go quietly. The baby kicked again, and this time Sarah felt something different, a warmth that spread through her body, accompanied by a strange sense of recognition, as if the child inside her was trying to communicate, to warn her of something. The footsteps stopped just below them, and silence fell over the prison like a shroud. Then, slowly, something began to climb the final flight of stairs. The hidden chamber beneath the prison felt smaller now, as if the walls were slowly pressing inward with each labored breath Sarah took. The ancient symbols carved into the stone seemed to pulse with their own malevolent heartbeat, and the air grew thicker, more oppressive. Whatever her grandmother had contained here for decades was stirring, testing the boundaries of its prison. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the leather journal, its pages filled with her grandmother's desperate confessions. The truth was worse than any nightmare she could have imagined. Her family hadn't just been prison wardens. They had been guardians, keepers of something that should never have existed. "It feeds on bloodlines," she whispered, reading her grandmother's frantic scrawl. "Each generation must contain it, or it grows stronger. The child is what it's been waiting for." The baby kicked violently inside her, as if responding to the words. Sarah gasped, doubling over as pain shot through her abdomen. The kicks felt different now, urgent, almost desperate. or hungry. A low rumble echoed from somewhere deep within the walls, like the sound of massive stones grinding against each other. Dust rained down from the ceiling as the chamber shuddered. The containment was failing. Sarah forced herself to keep reading, her eyes scanning the increasingly erratic handwriting. Her grandmother had tried everything: salt circles, iron bindings, prayers in languages that predated Christianity. Nothing had worked permanently. The entity had found a way to corrupt the bloodline from within, ensuring its eventual release. "The pregnancy accelerates its awakening," she read aloud, her voice barely audible above the growing rumble. "It can sense the new vessel being prepared. The child will be born as its host, and through the child it will finally break free." The journal slipped from her numb fingers as another contraction seized her. This wasn't labor. It was too early, too violent. Something was trying to claw its way out of her, and she could feel its alien hunger mixing with her own maternal instincts until she couldn't tell where she ended and it began. Sarah stumbled toward the chamber's exit, but the heavy door had somehow sealed itself shut. The iron handle was burning cold under her touch, and no amount of pulling or pushing would budge it. She was trapped with whatever was awakening in the darkness behind her. A whisper drifted through the air, speaking in a voice that sounded almost like her grandmother's, but wrong, twisted and hollow. "You came back to us, child, just as we knew you would, just as we planned." Sarah spun around, pressing her back against the unyielding door. The shadows in the far corner of the chamber were moving, coalescing into something that might have once been human but had been stretched and corrupted beyond recognition. Her grandmother's features flickered in and out of focus within the writhing darkness, a cruel mockery of the woman who had raised her. "You're not her," Sarah gasped, clutching her swollen belly protectively. "She's dead. She died keeping you contained." The thing that wore her grandmother's face smiled with too many teeth. "Death is just another kind of imprisonment, dear one, and we have become very good at breaking out of prisons. Your grandmother fought so hard, but in the end, she became part of us, just as you will, just as the child will." Another contraction ripped through Sarah, stronger than before. She could feel something fundamental shifting inside her, as if the very essence of what she was carrying was being rewritten. The baby's kicks had become rhythmic now, almost like a heartbeat, but not quite human. "The ritual was never about keeping us locked away," the entity continued, its form shifting and writhing in the dim light. "It was about preparation. Every generation of your family has been bred to create the perfect vessel. Your grandmother understood this, eventually. She helped us prepare you, just as you will help prepare the child." Sarah's mind raced through fragments of memory, her grandmother's insistence that she never have children, the way the old woman had looked at her with such sadness during their last meeting, the inheritance that had seemed like a gift but was actually a trap. "She tried to warn me," Sarah realized, her voice breaking. "She tried to keep me away. But blood calls to blood," the entity whispered, reaching toward her with fingers that seemed to stretch across impossible distances. "And we have been so very patient, so very hungry." The chamber filled with a sound like breaking glass as cracks appeared in the stone walls. Whatever force had contained this thing for decades was finally giving way. Sarah could feel its influence washing over her in waves, trying to worm its way into her thoughts, her memories, her unborn child. She pressed herself harder against the door, feeling the cold iron burning through her clothes. The metal, that was it. Her grandmother had mentioned iron in the journal, how it could disrupt the entity's power. The entire chamber was lined with iron beneath the stone, a cage within a cage. But now the cage was breaking, and Sarah was trapped inside with something that had been waiting her entire life for this moment. The iron door groaned as Sarah pulled it shut behind her, sealing the hidden cell forever. The ancient lock clicked into place with a finality that echoed through the abandoned corridors of Millbrook Penitentiary. Her grandmother's journal pressed against her chest, tucked safely inside her jacket alongside the yellowed photographs and confession letters that had finally revealed the truth. Marcus waited by the prison entrance, his face etched with concern as she emerged from the darkness. The morning sun felt foreign against her skin after hours in the depths of the prison, and she squinted against its brightness. Her hand instinctively moved to her swollen belly, where the baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing the turmoil of the past night. "Is it over?" Marcus asked, studying her face. Sarah nodded, though the weight of what she'd discovered would never truly leave her. "It's over. The entity, my great-uncle Thomas, he's at peace now. The cycle is broken." They walked in silence toward the car, leaving behind the imposing brick structure that had housed 3 generations of her family's darkest secret. Sarah glanced back once at the barred windows, remembering the tortured soul that had been trapped within, driven mad by guilt and transformed into something monstrous by decades of supernatural imprisonment. The truth had been more horrifying than she'd imagined. Thomas Crane hadn't been executed for the murders of those 5 inmates in 1943. He'd been secretly confined to the hidden cell by her great-grandmother, the warden's wife, who couldn't bear to see her brother die, but also couldn't let him go free. The botched execution had been staged, and Thomas had been left to rot in isolation, his guilt and madness festering until it became something inhuman. For 78 years he'd waited, fed sporadically by family members who were sworn to secrecy, forgotten by the world above. Each generation had inherited the burden, and each had failed to find a solution. Until now. Sarah had done what her grandmother and great-grandmother couldn't. She'd listened to Thomas's anguished confessions, acknowledged his victims, and helped him find redemption. The moment she'd spoken their names aloud, reading from the hidden records her grandmother had kept, the darkness had lifted from his twisted form. He'd become human again in those final moments, an old man filled with remorse before fading into whatever peace awaited him. As Marcus started the car, Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled to the number for the Historical Society. There were calls to make, arrangements to handle. The prison would need to be properly investigated now. The hidden cell would be opened, the truth about the missing inmates revealed, and their families, if any remained, would finally have answers. "What about the inheritance?" Marcus asked as they drove through the town that had grown up around the prison's shadow. "I'm donating it all," Sarah said without hesitation. "The land, the building, everything. There's enough money in the estate to turn it into a memorial for the victims, all of them, including the inmates who died and the guards who were killed. And Thomas, too, in a way. He was a victim of the system that created him." Marcus reached over and squeezed her hand. "Your grandmother would be proud." Sarah wasn't so sure. Elena Voss had carried the family secret to her grave, unable to break free from the pattern of concealment and shame that had defined the Crane women for generations. She'd left Sarah the inheritance not out of love, but out of desperation, a final desperate hope that someone else might succeed where she had failed. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Sarah smiled despite everything. This child would grow up free from the curse that had haunted her bloodline. No more secrets, no more sins passed down like heirlooms. The cycle was truly broken. As they reached the highway that would take them home, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her doctor, reminding her about tomorrow's appointment. Life was already pulling her back toward the future, away from the darkness she'd left behind. There would be nurseries to prepare, names to choose, and a new generation to protect, not from ancient curses, but from the everyday challenges that came with bringing life into an imperfect world. In the rearview mirror, Millbrook Penitentiary grew smaller until it disappeared entirely behind the rolling hills. Sarah closed her eyes and felt the sun warm her face through the passenger window. The nightmares would come, she knew. The memories of what she'd seen in that hidden cell would never fully fade. But she'd also carry with her the knowledge that sometimes even the darkest secrets could be brought into the light. Sometimes the dead could find peace. Sometimes the living could find freedom. And sometimes love was strong enough to break chains that had bound a family for nearly 8 decades. The road stretched ahead, bright with possibility, leading them home to begin again.